All right, so let's move on with the fourth part of our Reconstruction era series by talking about the meaning of freedom for the Southerners a little bit more. Sharecropping. I think this map in a lot of ways speaks for itself, so I don't have any notes on this slide, but if you studied European history, you could compare this to feudalism. Okay, so sharecropping means a share of one's crop. So sharecroppers were largely freedmen, and they rented out a small plot of land. And in order to pay for that land, they had to give their landlord a portion of their crop. And this portion was not a percent, it was normally a hard number. And there was little to no negotiation if the sharecropper did not meet this quota. And so, what that means is if you fell short, you were most likely going to be in debt for the next season. And that debt sometimes did not die with you, that debt would be passed down to your children. So, what this meant was that many sharecroppers were essentially bound to their land, much like serfs or peasants were in the medieval era. So, that means that in the Reconstruction era, many freed slaves, many freedmen, didn't go anywhere, not at least at first. We will see a black migration over time, but it takes a while, and that's very important for us to realize. So the crop lien system is not quite the same as sharecropping. It's a little bit more complex, but what this means is in addition to an interaction between the tenant farmer and the landowner himself, you also have a merchant who gets involved in this loan system. And so you could really pause this and try to make sense of it. I just want to provide a brief explanation. I don't want these videos to be too long each. But essentially, a tenant farmer also in the crop lien system would owe a merchant some debt as well. So oftentimes, a tenant farmer would borrow things like seeds and tools, supplies, even livestock from a merchant, and they would be charged up to 60% interest. And that is an insane amount. Some of the worst credit cards, for example, have interest rates in the 20%. So imagine 60. And of course, God forbid you damage one of these tools or something like that. You're not going to get your money back at all. Farmers also sometimes, yeah, get other supplies, right? But again, it's all on credit, and this is going to lead to even more debt. And crop lien, the word lien means loan or mortgage. And so, again, you don't get out of this debt even the only way you can get out of this debt even is by paying off even your merchant in some of the future crops that you produce. And so this is sort of a double whammy. You're going to owe two different parties money in this system. Not money, but something that's worth quite a bit. All right, so this is sort of like the slide we looked at in the previous video, if you remember. We were looking at black versus white political participation and the numbers of citizens that live in each state. So this is showing you once there are more voting rights for freedmen, certain states have a much higher political participation. So note South Carolina, which has actually more freedmen participating in politics. And part of that is because South Carolina was a hotbed of Confederate activity, and so you're going to see some former Confederate leaders still punished by Reconstruction, although Johnson's plan was rather lenient, so that's less and less the case. And Louisiana also, you see an even split. The Freedmen's Bureau, which we talked about previously, is also going to allow for the creation of many historically black colleges throughout the South, but some of these also they are the South, places like Maryland and the D.C. area, but they're also getting closer to the mid-Atlantic region. So you can see that many of these colleges crop up very close to Freedmen Bureau office locations so that they do have that protection of the federal government, both financially and in some periods militarily as well. So the Freedmen's Bureau actually applied to higher education. Briefly discussing historically black colleges. Many of these, in fact, were designed for what's called vocational education of freedmen. And that's more like learning a trade or a craft, and not so much those classic disciplines like history, math, science, and so on. And so often the result of these historically black colleges is that the kinds of jobs you would get after you graduated were still the kind of jobs where you were you were an employee, not an employer. Of course, there were some successful African Americans who emerged into the ranks of the middle class, but the black middle class was much smaller. And so there is gradual progress that is made with these colleges, but arguably not as much as some of the radical Republicans expected. Due to the Freedmen's Bureau and the radical Republicans protecting voting rights of many African Americans, you're going to see some African American men elected into Congress as well as also some gubernatorial positions. The first black senator was Hiram Revels, and so far, to provide some data about the present day, so far as of, let's see, we're in February 2018, 146 African Americans in total have served in Congress, and that includes both the House and the Senate. As of today, we have, actually, those numbers might be off. I apologize. Those numbers might be as of 2016. But as of today, we have, I'm going to cheat with my notes. I'm a terrible, terrible person here. Oh, I don't have my notes on these slides. Let's see, I know this from memory. As of today, we have 3 African American senators. We have Tim Scott of South Carolina. We have Cory Booker of New Jersey, and there are, let's see, Kamala Harris of California. So now there are 3, and proportionally, African Americans in 2018 make up 12.3% of the population. They make up 9% of the House of Representatives, and they make up 3% of the Senate. So with the House, you're seeing something that's a little bit closer to proportional representation, but in the Senate, there still is a long way to go. Today, that is. So if you're thinking about continuity and change, you could still think about the underrepresentation of African Americans in the federal government. But nonetheless, many whites and many supporters of the Confederacy overall are very upset by the increased black participation in politics. This is a cartoon that is mocking African Americans in Congress, and it's very much also dehumanizing them in the visuals that we see here. And so it's sort of articulating the idea that the federal government is still in a state of chaos, much as it was like before the Civil War started. Before the 15th Amendment, most of the people who voted actually were military veterans, most of the freedmen, that is. And that was something that Abraham Lincoln also supported. Now, again, the 15th Amendment did not start black voting. This was something that started earlier. But again, there were certain states that made it more difficult for African Americans to vote, most notably after the Ku Klux Klan arises. But the 15th Amendment, which is right here, is going to technically protect voting rights. But again, when you see the reemergence of some of the Southern hierarchical structures, that is also going to be difficult. So the 15th Amendment is the last of the Reconstruction era amendments, and I have the amendment language written down here, so let's read along. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And again, like the 13th, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So just like a lot of amendments, there needs to be an additional step. The amendment is not the law. The amendment just protects future laws in some ways, or existing laws in other cases. So the 15th Amendment is not enough per se to keep African Americans going to the polling places and feeling safe. The other thing is that the 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote, but not women at all. So actually, some of the white women that were ardent supporters of the abolition movement are going to be very upset by this. Some of them actually have a rather racist reaction. They are upset. They say, how come slaves could vote before us? And so you're going to see that even what will become the suffragette movement is going to divide on the color line. The Ku Klux Klan is sometimes referred to as the invisible empire of the South, and it's called that partially because in some ways it was a paramilitary organization. It was largely made up of former Confederate soldiers. It originated in Tennessee, and it was only about 6 men who were just in one regiment of the Confederacy. They returned home to Tennessee and saw the destruction in their hometowns, and they already acted in a vigilante way by executing ex-slaves during the war, so they proceeded by continuing to do it. So the KKK originated more as a small fraternal organization that spread underground throughout the state of Tennessee, but over time, Klan chapters cropped up all throughout the South, and eventually they decided to join forces under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a particularly skilled and bloodthirsty Confederate leader. So one of the most common things that the Klan members did was go on midnight rides trying to terrorize not only former slaves but also anyone who supported the Reconstruction cause. They would often engage in lynch mobs where they would kill freedmen or sometimes even white people who supported the freedmen. They oftentimes would create a crime, something like sexual harassment or rape. They would claim that a freedman would do something to a white woman and then stage this lynch mob. The lynch mobs were often popularly supported by townspeople. People would go and watch them just like people would watch an execution in medieval times. And the other part that made the KKK run unchecked in many ways was that oftentimes local politicians and police forces would actually be Klan members. So they would essentially get away with it because the law was part of the outlaws, as it were. And the KKK, of course, continues to exist to this day, and we'll see how it evolves over time. Because the KKK is challenged very quickly. The Radical Reconstruction government still has a lot of power in 1870 and 1871, and they passed two different acts of legislation, and they are technically called the Enforcement Acts, but they're often nicknamed the KKK Acts, and what they do is essentially ban the activity of the members of the KKK. And they bite back by saying that violates their First Amendment rights. And over time, the KKK does, even though it's driven underground for a while, it does remain active. And it is subsequently, in many ways, protected by the First Amendment. It's just the violence that they used to commit that is not protected. And so stopping the KKK acts themselves are often doomed by historians as a lost cause. You see the rise of, again, more of a sort of elite, aristocratic, would-be aspiring ruling class, rather aristocratic government by the South. They're nicknamed the Bourbons, which is a nod to the French royal family of the French Revolution. And they also often call themselves redeemers because they don't see this period as reconstruction or even, as Johnson used to say, restoration. They like to think that what they're doing is making the South exactly the way that it was before by taking the law into their own hands. And so the redeemers were oftentimes Democrats, and some of them were even the former sort of dying off Whig members that belonged to the Union. The Civil Rights Act was also an important Reconstruction piece of legislation. It made it unlawful for any person to deny any access to public places or jobs for freedmen. So it was essentially trying to outlaw the black codes themselves. It also tried to make it so that all white juries were illegal, but that oftentimes happened on a de facto basis anyway. And the reason why that is because the Civil Rights Acts were passed, but there was very little police force aside from the martial law that existed at the time from enforcing these laws. And as you can see by the date, the Civil Rights Acts are late in the Reconstruction era. They're in 1875, and so Reconstruction is already losing support at that point. And after the Civil Rights Act is passed, the next significant Civil Rights Act is not passed until 1964 under President Lyndon B. Johnson, and that's during the modern civil rights movement of the 20th century. So this is really the last time that the Radical radical Reconstructionists pass anything through Congress. So I mentioned in the, I forget which video, the third one maybe, that Johnson is impeached. We're going to do one more video that's looking at what happens when Grant is president, and then we'll talk about the election of 1876 and then the compromise of 1877 that effectively ends Reconstruction. So one more video and then we'll wrap it up, folks. Thanks as always, and stay tuned.